Welcome, Michael and Molly. How are you two?
Great. How you doing?
Good,
Doing
good.
great.
Thank you so much for being willing to be on the segment together so we can get the full exposure. I introduced you guys in the beginning, but why don't we do like a quick introduction for each of you? Michael, tell me about your background and sort of your perspective when you're talking about, you know, being an independent counselor. Should you hire an independent counselor? Should you tell your high school counselor about it? I mean, keep it short because that's the broader topic, but like, what's your background that makes you an expert on discussing this?
Yeah. So I've worked in education for 20 years now, 20 application cycles. About half of that time was as a college admissions advisor for a couple of different liberal arts colleges. And then I spent 7 years working as a high school counselor at a couple of different independent day schools. And now have been working as a independent consultant and working with Bright Horizons for the last 3 years. So kind of a lot of people talk about working on both sides of the
Hmm.
desk, kind of putting applications out the door and helping students or reviewing the applications and recruiting students. And then there's this third part, private counselors, which now I've been a part of as well. And so I think there's always been a lot of discussion about how do private counselors fit into the puzzle. And
Hmm.
so I've kind of seen it from a variety of different angles, and that's the perspective that I'm hoping to bring to the conversation today.
Hmm. Great, great. Thank you. Yeah, and our background is actually quite similar in terms of admissions, then college counseling in private high schools, then college coach, although I'm much older than you are. So, all right, Molly, how about you?
Yeah, so I am also a former admissions officer. I worked for several years at Fordham University in New York City, but then now with College Coach, I'm a director of client services. So a little bit different than Michael and Sally. I'm connecting with families who are considering hiring us
Hmm.
for private counseling support. So my perspective is that I'm talking to, hundreds of families every year that are considering, you know, private support.
Hmm. So I'm going to tell you guys just a quick story. I promise it'll be short. So I went on a fabulous trip in January. I'm on a boat with a bunch of people in Cambodia, and one of the women that I started hanging out with asked me, "So what do you do?" And I told her I work for Bright Horizons College Coach. I help, and she looks at me and she goes, "Varsity Blues," and I was like, "Really? We're on vacation, we're hanging out, and you're going to accuse me?" Of taking bribes and being a massive cheat. Now, she and I ended up getting along great. But I just thought, wow, it's been a few years, has has not gone away. So I want to like first address this to you, Molly, because I think you're probably the one who runs into this kind of thing the most and sort of like, is this something that you run into a lot, I guess I should say? Let's kind of tackle this because I think it feeds right into your kind of the initial thought about what you and I were going to talk about, which is some of the myths that people think about private counselors.
Yeah. And I'll admit, when I worked in admissions a long time ago, I maybe, I'm guilty of having similar thoughts initially around independent counseling. I think that independent counselors get a bad rap or can get a bad rap overall. And that's really because the industry is totally unregulated.
Hmm.
So there is a wide range of folks who are hanging up a shingle or hanging out a shingle to do this work. Everyone from former admissions officers like us who truly have the experience to, companies that are hiring college students or recent college grads or now even employing AI to do counseling work.
Hmm.
So, I think that that is a common, thought that we're all the same, and it's just not the case. I think families really have to do their due diligence around, when they're looking to hire somebody, what is the experience? Have you actually worked in an admissions office and made decisions and truly understand the process? Um, so I think, yes, that is something I run into, but less frequently now because I think families really are, yeah, doing that research and really getting a sense of what we do.
Hmm. Good. Yeah, and I think given how complex the process is, people are understanding that good help, meaning ethical and experienced, is can be a good thing, you know? So, Michael, did you have kind of a similar perspective when you worked in college admissions and when you were a private high school counselor?
Yeah, I think when I was in admissions, I was a little bit younger, and so I didn't really fully understand their role, to be honest. Like,
Mhm.
I figured, you know, students have high school counselors. Like, it's kind of like, what's the need to go above and beyond that? And as I've gone through and worked on the high school side and had a broader scope of this whole process, it's sort of like families will use their resources however they want. And when you think about like an athlete, they're going to play for the high school team maybe, and if they're a baseball player, they might hire a pitching coach on the side that they're also working with, or they might, if it's an artist, they may be working with a studio outside that they're paying for
Mhm.
extra time. And so kind of I view it as additional support at this point. And I think for a lot of students in particular, if they have a certain specialty, if if they're an artist or an athlete, or if they're looking into a certain region, or they're an international student, there's a lot of benefit to private advisory services, because a high school counselor is only going to have so much knowledge, and
Mhm.
oftentimes it's the schools that they know. It may be the geographically the schools that are in their area, and that may not be the goal of the student or the family. So really having a good understanding as a family on the front end of what you want to get out of the process and what are you going to get from the school, I think is really helpful before making the decision of, are we going to look to hire out additional resources?
Yeah. Well, and I'll just speak for myself. I mean, I had come from the University of Chicago and Whittier and Reed. I had a great background when I went into high school counseling, but I had not worked at a school that had engineering. So I don't think I was able to effectively advise any pre-engineering students. And I did have a couple. And I know so much more now than I did back then. And I kind of like looking back on it, I really didn't think anybody needed to hire an outside counselor if they were working with me, but looking back on it now, if they wanted to be a recruited athlete, sorry, I'm losing my microphone. It's like tilting down. So if somebody, had hired someone to help them with engineering or with sports recruiting or whatever it was, like, I'm like, yeah, that probably would have been a good idea. Now, I do feel good that all my students landed in great places, but I really wouldn't have blamed them because they asked questions that I couldn't answer. I'm just going to be honest about it. So Mollie, let's turn back to you. What are some of the, I think, biggest myths out there that you want to kind of like hopefully like start to bust during this show?
Yeah, there's a couple. I think maybe the big one is like, what is our role versus what is the student doing? Some myths might be, well, if I'm working with an independent counselor, then, I shouldn't feel proud about my work. It's not fully mine. This isn't
Mhm.
fully my process. I think that's a huge myth, and again, this is though goes back to our style of counseling. We're ethical. We're really guiding the student to produce their best work, really reflect on their wants and needs, make their best choices. So we're a guide through the process. We're not writing or
Mhm.
rewriting anything for a student. We're not suggesting, that they're inauthentic or presenting themselves in a way that's not truly representative of who they are. And I do think that is a question families have and are worried about. And once they hear that answer, that no, 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 we are supporting your student really through producing their best work and putting their best foot forward. It's all theirs. They should feel very proud at the end.
Mhm.
Um, Families feel very relieved to hear that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, every time I give advice, even for a student, like I'll say, you know, you want to think carefully about how you use your time. It might be used more effectively in this particular area, but I always tell them you're only in high school once. Don't drop something that you care about just to get into college, for example. Like the last thing I want to do is package a student. I want to help them put their best foot forward, but I want them to be high school students too. And I sometimes feel like I think people hire me expecting me to give them a formula to get in, and instead what I'm trying to do is help them kind of make careful decisions about, yeah, how do you put your best foot forward, but how do you experience high school at least some like the way it should be experienced as a time of exploration. So, Michael, I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I think a lot of families may have outcomes in mind when they start the process, and maybe that's some of the conversation that Mollie is having with them on the front door. You know, that this is the ultimate goal. I think our goal as advisory services is not where you hear bad actors, you know, you get into Varsity Blues, it's like if you're hearing something that's too good to be true, or if you're hearing companies saying like, I guarantee that we're going to get you into school X, Y, and Z, or this type of school, that's when you know you're kind of working with the wrong team of advisors
Mm-hmm.
that may not
Mm-hmm.
have your students' best interest at heart long run. So I think like you, Sally, in a lot of ways, I'm trying to dig into like what is ultimately going to make the student, you know, be able to show up at the 8 a.m. class on Friday morning because that's what they got stuck with. You know, how are they going to be happy on campus? Where are they going to find their people?
Mm-hmm.
What type of environment is that? And how do we match that with also the selectivity and some of the goals that the family may have in terms of outcomes? So going through that process, I think on an individual basis is something that's core to what we provide, you know, on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what private counseling should be about. I think there's a lot of people that may approach it in a different manner. And so if you are a family out there looking for good advisory services, I think having some of those questions about, you know, fit and what are the factors that are really important beyond academic prestige and maybe budget, some of those other things that that can really impact the student experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Molly, can you keep building any other myths that that you try and or kind of questions that you're eager to answer quickly and move beyond when you're talking to someone?
Yeah. Well, your comment about formula, that's a big one as well. You know, is there a formula? But then Michael also just touched on something, you know, that made me pause, which is fit, but we look at fit with the counseling style of the human, right? Of who's
Mm-hmm.
working with your student. I think if you're working, there are some families that will want to work with someone just because of their resume. Maybe they went to Harvard. That doesn't mean that chances of you working with that person will increase your chances of getting into Harvard.
Right.
We liken it just like a teacher, right? You could have a teacher with the most amazing pedigree and background. Doesn't mean you're going to connect with the teaching style of the class or really absorb the material. So I think
Mm-hmm.
we look at counseling similarly. We want to look at fit with how does the student learn? How do they respond? What sort of personality type and counseling style match is a great fit to motivate the student to really help them, you know, reflect on their wants and needs. So I think that fit with the educator, there's a bit of a, maybe not a myth, but just something I love to help families think a little more deeply about when they
Mm-hmm.
are shopping in this process and thinking about who could be a good fit to help their student and family through this.
Mm-hmm. So I'd kind of like to dig in also to something that like I'm kind of curious. When I worked in college counseling at Chadwick, my you know, honestly, there was a neighboring counselor who was terrible. Like she gave terrible advice. It was like I was sort of constantly having, and that was not fun, you know. And maybe as a result of that, my colleague there just didn't like private counselors at all and was frankly appalled when I was applying to get to this job. And I thought, you know what? If someone knows what they're talking about, you know, what's the problem here? Like if it's because there were like I had also known, like I even had private counselors in the area reach out to me and say, just so you know, one of your students is going off, like is really like having a challenging time for whatever reason. And I thought, how awesome is that? Let's try and partner. So I had a really different perspective from my colleague. And Michael, I'm just kind of wondering, like, what was your perspective? Did you like also have horror stories of bad, you know, counselors in the community that hadn't really worked in admissions and thus gave some pretty bad advice? Or did you mostly have a positive experience? Like, just kind of how did you feel about all that?
I think I went through a progression, to be honest. I started as a high school counselor, and I just kind of, in my first year on the job, I had so much going on that I just kind of ignored all of the noise that was happening with private counselors in
Yeah.
my community. And looking back, I kind of assumed that a lot of families probably would gravitate to a private counselor because they don't know this new guy who's coming into their community. They, you know, they have no idea what my background is.
Hmm.
So I think as I got into years 2 and 3, I really wanted to know more. I was more curious as to who was working with my students, more from a protective mentality of like who's giving them advice. Is it good advice? So I slowly started to reach out to a lot of the private counselors, and I started to see them at a lot of the different events that colleges would host, just to get a better sense of what their style was. Were they going to be someone that was going to be willing to partner with me to benefit the student, or was this someone that maybe I wasn't going to necessarily endorse or not endorse or talk badly about private counselors that were out there in the industry. I had a policy of not giving any advice and let the families
Mm,
make that decision. But also, I would also let families know what advisory services should be. You know, they should be ethical. They shouldn't be making guarantees. They shouldn't be out there producing work for you. And I let them know what I could do, which is some things that I could do as a high school counselor I can't do as a private counselor, like pick up the phone and advocate for a
mhm,
student. I'm not going to be the one writing the letter. So they still do need to have that relationship with me as a high school counselor, even though they're also going to be working with a private counselor too. So I think finding that balance over time of really being comfortable with the private counselors that my students were working with and having an understanding of whether what their level was, what were they good at, what would
mhm.
they maybe, where did they maybe have some deficiencies.
Mhm. So I love what you said just there about partnering with them. I think that yeah, that's really kind of the way to do it. And then the other thing too is don't recommend individual counselors, but let people know what to look for. Like if you took a course online on college counseling, that doesn't make you as qualified as someone who worked in admissions. If you graduated from Harvard, which Molly, you talked about, that doesn't mean that you know why you got into Harvard. Frankly, you probably don't. I mean, the kind of myths that I hear from students who went to these top schools, they say, well, it was my essay. And I'm like, I promise you that the essay was one piece among a lot of different pieces. Like I could promise you without having seen your application at all. So, all right, well, let's go ahead and take a break and we'll return to this topic at the right when we come back.